Hi everyone, and welcome back to Real Estate Unlocked, your go-to mini-series where we break down everything you need to know about buying and selling a home. In today's episode, we're talking about Section 10, additional terms of the Manitoba Offer to Purchase. Let's get started. So Section 10 is where we customize the offer so that it actually fits your specific situation and not just a standard template. This is where we include anything that needs extra clarification or doesn't quite fit elsewhere in the offer. Think of it as the section that ties up all the loose ends and it makes sure that everybody is on the same page. So Part 1 allows us to write additional terms directly into the contract. These are terms that are going to add clarity, modify existing wording, or address unique situations in the transaction. If there isn't enough space to write these terms here, then they can be detailed in a Schedule 2, which is then checked off in Part 1 and attached to the offer. Part 1 also lists any schedules that are going to be attached to the contract. So these can be things like the property disclosure statement, additional terms and conditions, or mortgage assumptions if applicable. These schedules are just as important as the main agreement. Once they're included, they do become legally binding. So Part 2 explains how all these additional terms work together from a legal standpoint. We're going to go through the key clauses together. So written terms only. The only changes to the contract are the ones written in Part 1 or included in an attached schedule. Verbal promises, text messages, or those we've talked about it, none of those are going to hold any weight. If it's not in writing, it does not exist. Conflicts between terms. If there's a conflict between the standard wording and something written in Part 1 or an attached schedule, then Part 1 wins. This is why accuracy here is very critical. These custom terms override the standard contract language. Breach of contract. This section explains what happens if one party breaches the contract. So for example, if the buyer defaults, the seller may be entitled to keeping the deposit and potentially pursue for additional damages. It's important to note that by keeping the deposit, that doesn't automatically cancel the contract. It still needs to be properly dealt with. Risk, insurance, and damage before possession. So until the transaction completes on possession day, risk is going to remain with the seller. That means that the seller needs to maintain their home insurance. And if the property suffers any major damage before possession, then the buyer is going to have options. This can include getting an inspection done, any sort of remediation, or in some cases, terminating the contract altogether. Entire agreement clause. So this clause confirms that the written contract contains everything agreed to, that any changes must be made in writing and signed by both parties, and that buyers rely on their own inspections and the written representations in the contract, and not informal promises. The remaining clauses in this section cover some of the behind-the-scenes legal details that help keep the transaction running smoothly. They confirm how personal and transaction information can be used for things like MLS reporting, statistics, and market data. They also confirm that Manitoba law applies to this contract, that Manitoba time is used, and that time is of the essence, meaning deadlines in the offer truly matter. This section also sets clear rules around assignment and nomination. So in simple terms, a buyer can't just assign the contract to someone else without the seller's written approval. It also explains lender-related requirements, confirming that the seller agrees to sign any reasonable documents required by the buyer's lender to complete financing. And finally, it notes that the lawyers involved may exchange trust conditions and undertakings to properly complete the transaction. So Section 10 is where the offer becomes deal specific. If something matters to you, timelines, tenants, repairs, special agreements, this is where it must be clearly written. Remember, if it's not in writing, it doesn't exist. That's it for this week's episode of Real Estate Unlocked. If you found this helpful, make sure to like, subscribe, and follow along as we continue breaking down the offer, one section at a time. I'll see you next week.